Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Game Week 29 cheat sheet preview. Now, of course, this is a monumental week because we have once again another substantially large double game week, and that is going to be followed by Game Week 30, which is a big blank game week that includes a lot of players that we would like to capitalize in 29. These are going to be players who play for Arsenal and Spurs specifically, and then you have other double game weeks coming from other teams that you might not want to be too invested in, such as Everton, where I think a transfer of Gordon might make sense if you're trying to do a make weight transfer, for example, to get into, let's say, someone like Kane, who's in a very unique position of being one of the only kind of expensive strikers that you'd like. Or you could also opt to go for some other double game week players this week if you are potentially looking for a 3 hit and 30, even though I think the ceiling isn't great for that. But let's actually have a look at the transfers for this week and the kind of movements in terms of the defenders. Starting with the defense, I think in the sort of budget positions, I think you have a lot of changes here. This is simply due to how the end of the season will probably pan out. I think it's worth mentioning that Ben White, of course, is a sort of priority transfer this week if you're looking for a simple transfer. And once again, another make weight in this position who will be playing in game week 30. And that's what Ben White provides. He doesn't really have any sort of, I think, goal scoring potential, really. He is clearly much more inferior to Gabriel when it comes to scoring from headers, and he hasn't shown too much proficiency in kind of winning aerial duels, even on the defensive end. So he's really here to kind of hedge. And maybe if you don't have Ramsdale, you could opt to go for Ben White to kind of cover the Arsenal defense. This is a nice option, I think, for people who might be Sa owners. But let's move on to Chambers. Chambers is an interesting one. We just saw him have 2 goal involvements in 2 games for Aston Villa within the double game week. This Aston Villa team is incredibly in form, and not to mention that, but just the back-to-back clean sheets from this Aston Villa side have been quite a pleasure to actually see. I don't think we really expected that from this week. Obviously, Cash was the main sort of leader in this game week when it comes on the defensive end, but as we know, this Aston Villa defense is called upon to actually be a pivotal part of the attack. And we've seen even Chambers coming from the centre-back position being involved. I wouldn't necessarily say he makes a lot of sense as an option to go for. I'd probably still prefer going for Cash if you actually wanted to ever move into an Aston Villa player. This is more, I think, geared around people who are looking towards wildcarding potentially this week, just because I think having an Aston Villa or even 2 Aston Villa players to round out the rest of the season might be quite sensible. If you look at the underlying statistics, they are clearly almost a top 5, top 6 team right now in the Premier League, and that's a really positive sign for me to actually look into owning at least one of the defenders and then one of their attackers. Amarty and Sharon Byrne, Livramento and KWP, they all stand in these sort of differential positions. And the thing for me with Amarty, of course, is Amarty is once again another make weight who plays for Leicester, who will have a lot of games where if you're looking at, let's say, building a team that stretches out towards the end of the season and also a player who actually plays in Game Week 30, you have that option, Amarty, and I think he is very good as a wildcard option, as a cheap option as well, to round out for the rest of the season because you don't really have that sort of access to the Leicester defense. The one thing, of course, is that he might be more prone to rotation than some of the other players in this team. But with some double game weeks ahead, he could be an interesting option, at least for you to summon upon in those specific games. With Shaw and Byrne, we've seen them do a little bit more from the sort of offensive end, but we don't expect too much from them. These are players who are sort of filling positions in this team. Byrne, of course, was that winter transfer that was very, very necessary for Newcastle, and Shaw's position is obviously also dependent on whether Trippier plays and things like that. But I think Shaw has been a massive contributor in the underlying stats for this Newcastle team so far, and he looks like an interesting option. But ultimately, we've just gone past the Newcastle double game week this week, where he did do rather well, but I would say the next week is slightly worse, especially since they will be facing against Chelsea, where I imagine, especially with Chelsea actually finding quite a bit of form in terms of goal scoring recently, I would say this is not the most brightest option to actually opt for Newcastle players. I'd be happy to maybe flex around with the Newcastle midfielder still, someone like Fraser, but we can see this is actually quite a complete side. And the weird thing about Newcastle so far is we've seen a lot of involvement from multiple players across the pitch and not necessarily a focal point. I would say the one person might be Fraser, who actually takes a lot of the burden in terms of the attack, just because he actually provides a lot of creativity to the field and also a lot of sort of forced kind of underlying creativity through the set pieces. So for me, if I was ever to go for a Newcastle option, it would probably be Fraser. And if you were going for a wild card, I mean, maybe it might make sense to go for Dubravka this week if you're someone who wants to stick with Sa as a keeper. but once again, not the brightest of options. And then the Southampton defense has really, I think, upset a lot of people who actually opted to go for them this week. And I actually thought they looked quite well, especially in the cup game versus West Ham, and then just also recently with their performances where they were able to get some great results. But as I said, with Aston Villa looking so good, that might be a big dampener. And Newcastle, if you've actually seen, post the winter transfer, have been a very formidable team, actually only really losing in the cup. And so maybe that kind of clouds our judgment over whether Livramento and KWP are good options. But I think at this point in time, there's not much to be said about this defense. I just don't think it's really worth holding, especially they don't play any games in Game Week 30, and so it's a good time to actually move out of these players and maybe look for a make weight in that sort of direction. Ait Nouri is actually someone who rose again. This was an interesting week because we had a very poor first sort of leg performance with Wolves and then a very good second half. Unfortunately, they were playing versus Watford, but I have given a kind sort of rise to Ait Nouri just to sort of pay respects to the overall performance that he had versus Watford today. I thought he looked very good. And the main thing, of course, is once again going to be the concerns with Marcel. But I think if you own Ait Nouri in your team, this is almost a cry out to say just keep him in your team, at least for Game Week 30. Don't really think about transferring him out, I would say. He should be kept at the back of your bench probably for this week. And then you can maybe think about another option in Game Week 30 and beyond. So after that sort of blank game week, it could be a time to move out of Ait Nouri, but for now, I'd keep him. As far as Doherty, he's the one sort of person that I would realistically think about in terms of transferring in the sort of 4.6 to 5.0 range. Doherty is an interesting player just because we've seen Emerson not provide very much in the final third. And as I mentioned this season, we've seen players like Reguilon actually provide a lot, even though he has very limited minutes. But Doherty has shown that he actually has the fitness to actually play back-to-back games, which I think is a really promising sign. Not only that, but Conte is, for me, a manager who actually backs players who performs for him. And Doherty has shown that. Emerson has had plenty of opportunities to impress. And in my opinion, he's done the opposite and probably depressed Conte, to be fair. Whereas Doherty, these last two games, yes, it's a small sample size, and I think it's not worth really extrapolating the data from that. But just in terms of form, I think it's an interesting upside pick because you have a double game week, and then you have a player playing Game Week 30. So I think Doherty is a great chance for this week. If you're already, for example, invested into Arsenal, just because I think the Spurs double game week is slightly better. Cody remains in his position here. I was actually going to drop him, but ultimately you still have a player here who is going to be playing Game Week 30, so not really a sensible reason to drop him now. Kilman is clearly someone who doesn't really belong on the list anymore because he's been phased out of the side, potentially with Bolly coming back. Bolly, of course, spent a long time on the sidelines, and we did note in the previous year that he actually was suffering from long COVID and has sort of had an extended absence from football. So I think with the clean sheet versus Watford, that was a promising sign and probably a kind of call for Kilman to be exited from teams. So it would make sense to go out of Kilman, but definitely not out of Cody this week. As far as the 5.0 to 5.3 range, we now see a rise once again in Cash. I was actually only going to rise him one level, but the performance over the double game week overall was monumental. And Cash, of course, is slightly different to Tavernier, from Rangers, just because he doesn't take as many set pieces as Tavernier. But within open play, I think Cash has found some sort of newfound confidence that has been insane. And if you look at his underlying stats, even his just actual points output from the last 2 weeks, he's been monumental as a player. And so there's no real reason to actually take Cash out of your team. He plays in Game Week 30 once again. And as I said, with Aston Villa looking so good and so hot, both on the defensive and offensive end, with a lot of players getting involved, the fullbacks getting a license to actually push forwards and attack, then I think Cash is a great option. I've actually separated him from Dean. I don't really think there's a reason to go for Dean at this point now. I think Cash is clearly probably the better option. He's just enjoying his football a lot at the moment, something that's a little bit of a sort of wishy-washy phrase, but I think it's certainly true for a player who's this in form. Gabriel is another great option, but I think once again, it's a little bit of a differential. I still prefer Tierney a little bit over Gabriel, but I think you're kind of comparing realistically apples and apples. Both of them can find their ways to sort of providing points for the team in different ways. Tierney is someone who spams a lot of crosses, and even though the expected sort of assists aren't super high, I think with him actually providing so many crosses, they eventually do turn into gold. And with Gabriel, we know he's a huge set piece threat and has been for the last 2 years back to back. With Reguilon, the reason why he rises is because of the Sessegnon injury and the sort of disclaimer from Conte that Sessegnon might not be able might not be able to play for a while, and that's a huge positive because we saw Reguilon come off the bench in the recent Spurs match versus Everton, and he actually found his way onto the score sheet. And if you look at these sort of attacking positions that these fullbacks are taking in the Spurs team, I mean, I think it would be a big miss for most managers to at least sort of sidestep at least one of the fullbacks from Spurs this week. I think you can either choose between Doherty and Reguilon. Reguilon might be the more interesting option because I think he generally is, in my estimation, is the better player. But you have to absolutely consider fitness as a factor. Nothing to do really with Reguilon and his ability to actually create within minutes. I just think that Doherty might actually have a better hold over the position because he's shown he has the fitness to play games back to back. And I think Conte will actually show faith towards Doherty. With Reguilon, and that's why I sort of kept him as a differential. I think he's shown a lot of upside in some weeks and also a lot more downside than his counterpart in Doherty. So that's sort of the kind of mix and mash there. With Laporte and Thiago Silva and Alonso, nothing much really to discuss in the sort of 5.4 to 5.9 range. I don't think there's anything super interesting this week. I think if you've been holding two City players and actually have kept them for this period, it is probably time to actually exit out of one of them. It's a very logical move towards the Liverpool defender this week. If you're owning someone like Cancelo, no real reason to maybe take him out of your team unless you want to sort of gamble towards these double game weeks. And I think I might be one of the managers who would be looking to do that. With James, you obviously have the news that he's injured if you look further down the list. So it's a great time really to actually move into a Liverpool defender, which is why exactly that Robertson and Van Dijk have both risen. And, you know, sort of as a counterpoint, I've dropped players like Diaz and Laporte, who I see as those sort of second option Man City players. Not to mention that I think I've kept Cancelo here as the best option. He was reported as being sick from Pep, but you probably would love to have him in your team 32 and beyond. The one thing I would say about Cancelo is with Crystal Palace, for some weird reason, I think if you've been watching the Man City Crystal Palace games for a long time now, Crystal Palace have always been a bogey team of Man City. This Crystal Palace team, of course, is very different to the Roy Hodgson teams, and they play in a completely different style. But I thought they matched up very, very well, almost parking the bus in a similar sort of manner to the traditional way that Roy Hodgson does when they first faced with Man City this season. And that was already a Man City team in form, and they were one of the teams to actually break the sort of win streak of Man City. So I do think that's going to be a little bit of a tough opponent this week. And then when you consider the blank game week in 30, I think it's very justifiable that City fall. And that's going to be the sort of summary for the defenders. In terms of the midfielders, you've got a lot of movements here once again. And as I said, this is going to be one of the most packed cheat sheet videos in a long, long time. A lot of stats to go through, a lot of players to rise, fall, and introduce to you guys. With Gordon, you have a rise because of Everton's double game week. He's been an exceptional player this season, I think, as a standout young player at a sort of fantastic price point. And he is going to be one of those make weights that we sort of discussed. And this episode is interesting because I think a lot of people will be considering wildcarding potentially even in this week. I know it doesn't seem to make sense, especially with 3 hit 30 coming up, but a lot of people will be playing various chip strategies, and I don't think there's necessarily a certain wrong one. Some people will also be looking to take hits, and Gordon might be a part of that just because he provides you the double game week as a little bit of security for the hit. And then you can kind of pair him up with getting players like Kane, who some people have felt have been eluding their team. So this is a great time to actually look at Gordon as a make weight there. Elanga is someone who falls, just no real interest in Man United's games, nothing to do really with him as a player. If you look further down within the 5 to 6 range, you have Kulusevski rising alongside Martinelli and Odegaard. Just to discuss briefly, I think Kulusevski has been considered by some people as rotation prone. I have actually mentioned that he's one of my favorite options, and if you watched my wildcard video last week, you would know that Kulusevski was someone who I highly rated in the wildcard specifically. So with what I would say about Kulusevski is, for me, he is a much better team player than Lucas Moura. Lucas Moura might be a little bit more individually technically skilled, but when you watch Kulusevski play, you can see that he is very, very good at making decisions in the right positions, in dangerous positions too. With Lucas Moura, I think it's almost where you're expecting to pass to him and hope that he can pull out the same magic that he did versus Ajax in that sort of 10.0 game as rated by L'Equipe. But here you have a situation where Kulusevski, for me, is a very consistent performer. And over the last few weeks, we've seen that Conte has faith in his fitness too. So he's gotten a lot of games with 90 minutes in the bank. He looked exceptional versus Man City, and once again has done so in the last 2 games as well, with the Everton performance being a very kind of quiet, reserved one where he always made the right sort of final third pass. And his ability to do that, and also I think just be a sort of third option that is actually a consistent threat alongside Kane and Son, who will probably be taking more of the defensive attention, means that you have Kulusevski as an option who hopefully might be served as someone who can get goals when, let's say, if you take the example of the first goal versus City, when Son actually cut it back to Kulusevski, could be that sort of decoy who actually gets a lot of goals by just being in the right position. And I think Kulusevski has shown to be an incredibly all-around player. I would encourage you to watch highlights of his loan in Parma as a sort of way to maybe have an understanding of him a little bit better as a player alongside some of his recent highlights, just to understand why you might want to take the sort of bad year in a sense in Juve out of your estimations, because for me I think he's a very complete player. Martinelli and Odegaard, I have been talking about them for quite a bit this season. They're very contrasting players. I would say Martinelli is one of the more direct players in the Premier League, and when you're watching him play, he has that sort of direct mentality of wanting to always score even in sort of low chance opportunities. And I think Martinelli has incredibly picked up form like he did 2 years ago when he was sort of a breakout player under Emery. This season, he's looked exceptional and he found a fantastic shot versus Watford. I would still prefer Saka here, simply when I compare these sort of Arsenal players, even Smith Rowe, for example, just because Saka, for me, is someone who's a little bit more complete as an FPL asset. He is someone who consistently gets assists, consistently gets goals, whereas Martinelli, I would say, is someone who probably more consistently gets goals and less so assists. And Odegaard is probably someone who you would expect to get much more assists, especially now that he's almost playing a little bit deeper in the midfield than he has at certain points in the season. However, Odegaard for me still has fantastic vision. I think he clearly has world-class creativity, and that's why he's an interesting option. They're obviously both cheaper options than Saka, and perhaps that's what you're looking for in your team. I would still say that they're compared to Saka differentials, but it makes a lot of sense to opt for Saka this week, I think, if it's a free transfer. I wouldn't necessarily take a hit to go for an Arsenal player, but it's not really a problem, especially if you're transferring out players like Bowen. It would be very sensible to go out of someone like Bowen, even though Arsenal are playing Liverpool in one of those double game week games. So for me, you're seeing that as an opportunity to maybe get a +2 and then hopefully a little bit of a nice consolation goal versus Liverpool. I think that's probably what you're expecting, just because Arsenal haven't been the best, I would say, versus sides that are a little bit more stacked and top heavy compared to them this season. Arsenal, by contrast, I think have really stepped up when facing the bottom half of the opposition. And for me, actually, just considering Leicester last week and their defense versus Leeds, I actually thought Leeds looked quite good versus Leicester, but maybe even sort of considering in light of the Aston Villa game, keeping in mind that Aston Villa also did blow Southampton out of the park, who also looked quite decent. I would say maybe Arsenal are somewhere in the middle of the top half right now in terms of their capability of beating teams like City and Chelsea and Liverpool. I wouldn't really rate them too highly in being able to complete that performance. So as I said, these are very sensible options, especially if you're sort of taking out a player who doesn't play in 30 as well, if you're going for an Arsenal asset. As far as Rafinha, Gallagher, and Barnes, this is another tier of players that we've constantly been looking at this season. Saka is at the prime of your list, and I think when you're looking at direct replacements to Bowen, there aren't too many options right now. I think downgrading is very sensible this week, especially towards an Arsenal player or Kulusevski. When you look at Rafinha and Gallagher, the reasons why they've fallen are just well, first of all, with Gallagher, it's mostly fixture dependent. I don't think I think he's playing in a much more competent team all around. If you look at the players around Crystal Palace, I think they've all shown much more bright spots than the sort of, I would say, companions that Rafinha has had this season with Leeds. I think there's a clear drop off, and really the performances haven't looked any better with Bielsa being sacked. Of course, you have to allow a manager to have some time with his team, and perhaps the results will come in due time. Rafinha, of course, does play versus Norwich, but I see this almost as a last chance opportunity as a Rafinha owner to actually play Rafinha. The team looked absolutely woeful versus Aston Villa. They really struggled to make it past the halfway line, and Rafinha was pretty much reduced to actually looking for cross-field passes from the halfway line, with Bamford actually pressing around the centre circle. It looked like a very abysmal performance to me, and I don't really have too much hopes for Leeds versus Norwich, but I think the one hope is that Norwich and Watford combined are probably one of the worst teams in the league, and probably still this much slightly worse than Leeds. With Barnes, I think he's a great differential. Obviously, a player who at one point was overpriced, but I think in recent weeks he's actually picked up form, and that's very normal for a player recovering from what should be a long-term injury. And especially with Maddison's slightly more reserved minutes recently, and maybe him having some slight fitness problems, I think this is a great opportunity to look at Barnes for the weeks ahead. Clearly, he's probably not going to be a transfer that you're thinking about this week. I think Barnes is probably a transfer for game week 30, especially if, let's say, Rafinha disappoints and you want to have that sort of leverage by going for a Leicester player. You could obviously go for someone like Daka as well, who has shown to be an interesting asset, and especially with the Vardy news, is going to be someone who you'd like to probably leverage off for Leicester. But keep in mind, Maddison is in this sort of same bracket tier, and might just be a little bit more explosive overall than Barnes, just because he has that sort of creative aspect to his game. Whereas Barnes, I would say, is very direct and also very capable of scoring goals. But probably when it comes to overall FPL hauls, I would say Maddison is much more set up for these sort of double-digit explosive hauls himself. As far as midfielders this week, I've actually dropped Mount, but he had once again a great performance for Norwich. I will say though that I think Norwich are one of the worst teams in the leagues, and I think it's not a huge positive to see a player do well versus Norwich and use that to sort of push whether a player should be rated highly. In my opinion, I think you almost treat that game as a one-off. I mean, Tony had a hat-trick versus Norwich, and we've not really seen a very complete performance this season from Tony himself. I would say, of course, his Brentford team might be enjoying also playing alongside Ericsson and having that sort of break around the Christmas time to actually recuperate from the very poor form they were showing, especially after they capitulated versus Burnley and found a successive bad run post that result. But I think ultimately Mount just doesn't seem like too interesting an option for now. He's obviously off pens as well when Jorginho plays, and I think Havertz has just been that much more of a focal point of this Chelsea team. He's been playing effectively as a 9 lately and looked very, very good. 8 goals and assists combined in his last 8 starts, and clearly a player who's one of the more informed players in this Chelsea team. Coutinho, I don't think there's really much to be said. He had a fantastic game week, and I would be hard pressed to say that this would be. I know a lot of people are suggesting actually moving out of Coutinho, but I really have a hard time sort of justifying that in my head. I think, yes, it's a very tough game versus West Ham, and West Ham have shown to be a very competent defense. Once again, that sort of 0-1 loss to Liverpool being another justification of that. For me, Coutinho is someone you could actually look to keep for towards the end of the season. And just because he plays at 30, I think covers this Aston Villa team very, very nicely, as he is still the focal point. With Jota and Diaz, they inevitably have to rise. Liverpool have once again another double. And I think Jota, if you've been watching his performances versus Arsenal over the last 2 years, you would understand, especially if you're an Arsenal fan, that this guy has it all really versus Arsenal. And I would compare the performances to be almost Drogba-esque in terms of how well he does versus Arsenal specifically. With Luis Diaz, you have another great option too, who has shown to be a very pivotal rotation piece at this point in the season. A very big difference maker for this Liverpool team, which I think in the ability that he can actually allow for more rotation and rest for players like Mane. Salah, of course, has shown to be, the epitome of physical fitness, and he doesn't really need too much rest. I think clearly Minamino plays a great role filling in for him in cup games, such as the FA Cup. But Diaz, for me, has been a great option too over the course of the season. A very creative, technical dribbler, someone with a lot of flair. If you've been watching the Copa America and his recent performances too. So for me, they're both great options, but I would just be a little bit more tempted towards going for Jota just because of his history with Arsenal. Whether or not you actually think that actually bears any fruit in real life is up to you, but I think there's always going to be that sort of slight hidden gem factor with Jota here in a very good matchup. Foden and Sterling unfortunately fall, and Mahrez I've sort of put them in the same bracket. I think these are all great players this season, and their underlying stats have been fantastic. But simply put, I would put the double game week players within priority here. If you're owning players like Foden, Sterling, and Mahrez, or even KDB, I think it's a good time to maybe go out of them. Maybe go for a differential Liverpool midfielder at this point in time, or maybe just go for someone like Son. That's a great time to actually go for that move too. As far as Mane, he rises and Bruno falls for similar sort of reasons. Man United don't have a particularly good game. And then you have Mane with another double game week where he could once again probably match Salah's haul. Mane has actually been really, really good post AFCON, which is something I actually mentioned as to why he was such a great differential to Salah in Game Week 26. And so once again, you have another opportunity here to look at both of them as triple captain options. You wouldn't be remiss if you went for either of them. And now let's round out things with the forwards. So Broja here is going to be the sort of fall. I think Southampton had a very dismaying performance in what we expected to be quite a solid double game week, especially considering the transfers we had, or rather the fixtures that we had in place. The same with Dennis in a sense. Dennis clearly obviously had tougher games, but he clearly had opportunities to score. And I think that Arsenal defense was rather fragile in that sort of game versus Watford. So a little bit of a disappointment to see both of them sort of blank in what should have been a nice week. Broja continues what should be a good run of fixtures versus Watford next week. So I think I wouldn't be, justified to actually drop him towards a differential at this point in time. I think Broja still has a great opportunity to actually start for most teams and actually contribute based on that. As far as Dennis, I think his time is sort of dried up. It does seem weird to actually look for alternative options to move away from Dennis. I know some people might not have the cash to move out of Dennis for now, but it is a very sensible time to move out of Dennis for sure. I put Mateta and Pookie around his tier just because these are sort of players where Mateta is the most rotatable player here and clearly playing for a better team. But Dennis and Pookie are sort of focal points of the Watford and Norwich teams respectively. And even though their teams have overall been doing poorly, I think they have still been shown to be bright lights of both teams and very capable Premier League players at least. But overall, their teams are almost too poor. And I think when we consider the back half of the season, you have much better options, especially with this Brentford team maybe picking up a little bit of form. So side grades to players like Tony make a lot of sense for me. Tony's also nice because I think he actually plays in game week 30, and so he could be a great option and a great differential in that sort of week when a lot of people might be looking to stretch towards Leicester players. If Brentford are able to sort of sneak that game away from Leicester and Tony puts in a good performance, which he has actually in many games back to back now, then you actually have Tony, who would be a very great option for the next 2 weeks. Tony, for me, as I said, would probably make more sense as a game week 30 transfer, so I wouldn't talk too much about him now. I've added Ings, Calvert-Lewin, and Richarlison as well within the bracket just below. At 7.0 to 8.1, of course, that's going to be a bit of a stretch of a budget, but Calvert-Lewin and Richarlison do have great games ahead. I wouldn't be too interested in going for either Calvert-Lewin or Richarlison. Overall, Everton have been too poor for me to really consider them, and their defense, I would say, has faltered in the last few weeks. And I think when you look at Lampard and his sort of tenure in Chelsea, I think his inability to organize the defense is going to be a damning feature of this Everton side, who might be destined for relegation, unfortunately, under Lampard. And that's just going to make it all the much more harder for players like Calvert-Lewin, Richarlison, or even Gray to perform. Gordon, as I said, makes a lot of sense as a make-weight transfer, but I wouldn't really consider them right now. Ings is someone who, as we've watched this sort of new Aston Villa side with Ings and Chambers showing sort of consistent features now and proving to be worthwhile for these teams. He's shown to be a great option and a great differential to Watkins. He's of course at the same price, so not that interesting. But Watkins really hasn't been, I would say, a much of a bright light this season. He almost runs and makes these sort of winger runs like a well. I mean, he does play as a center forward who almost plays like he's against a back three. He makes these diagonal runs away from the defense and actually takes away a lot of space so that players like Coutinho have much more central space in behind in that sort of 10 position. So he makes these sort of decoy runs that I think aren't really beneficial to him actually doing well as an FPL asset. Sometimes he does get these goals as a sort of advanced forward and being able to kind of run off the shoulder of his defenders if he's not offside. But Ings, of course, we know is a much more traditional sort of central threat, and he has shown to be that sort of option in the double game week so far. So Ings might be an interesting option if you want to look at a bit of a differential when you head towards game week 30 and or even crafting a sort of wild card potentially to end the season with. Lacazette is someone who also rises within this cheat sheet this week. He has a great run of games with this Arsenal team. The one thing I would say is maybe a lot of people have been invested into, let's say, double Arsenal defense and maybe one Arsenal midfielder or even two Arsenal midfielders. And Lacazette clearly is a little bit more of an overpriced option. Not exactly a player who I'd love to spend the budget on. He hasn't been a huge goal threat, but has been very creative this season, providing a lot of space and being in the right areas to actually support his team at times. And perhaps that's actually all you want from Lacazette. He has also scored a few more goals recently as of late, but I think still a little bit overpriced as an option. But you can't really dismiss Lacazette when there are so few good forward options. And in the double game week, I think it's very hard to miss him out. Ronaldo and Lukaku fall for very, very obvious reasons. I think right now this is just simply the time for Kane, especially with Vardy being injured. Apologies, let me just update that. As far as the goalkeepers, not many movements that we should really be concerned about. Just falls to Guaita, Sa, and Pope, which I think are very obvious. You clearly have Dubravka here with the double game week, and the Ramsdale too as a great option. Ramsdale for me makes a little bit more sense, even though he does face Liverpool. I just kind of fancy Liverpool's ability to give maybe Ramsdale some save points because the Arsenal defense is still at the end of the day quite composed. I think even if you look back towards the Arsenal versus Liverpool game earlier in the season, he still had a decent performance when it came down to points, despite them conceding so heavily. And so that's going to be my cheat sheet for this week. A lot of changes as discussed on Twitter, but I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I will see you guys very shortly for the next video. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching the video. I've added a new Hall of Fame segment here to shout out some of our YouTube members who've been supporting me and the provision of content over the course of this FPL season. If you'd like to support my content, feel free to join as a member of the community here. You'll also be able to access a private chat with me on the daily basis where you can discuss anything from FPL, your team, transfers, or general football, or daily life even. So thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.